Hi, and welcome to our class of Introduction to Sanskrit. This introductory class is a beginner class. It's just to open the path, and the purpose of this class is simply to allow us two things. A, to relatively properly pronounce Sanskrit, and B, especially, to develop the ability to read what is called Sanskrit transliteration, as you can see on the screen now. How do we read this word which is written? It's got dots underneath some of the letters, and this one, where we have all sorts of lines above the letters, and there's different types of S's, etc. Now, in this class, I'm going to focus on that 20% of the information, which is going to yield us 80 or 90% of the results. What does that mean? It means that this lesson is going to be very simple, and it's going to make our Sanskrit as accurate as we can achieve within this class. About 80 to 90% accuracy in how we pronounce and how we read the Sanskrit. That extra 20% to really be accurate in the way that we're pronouncing it will require much more study, but we want to make it really simple and make it acceptable. So what you're going to study here is going to be as close as we can get to really pronouncing Sanskrit properly without having to go into a very long process. I'm going to give you some general guidelines, some tips, which are really going to make it very easy, because this text that appears might seem to be daunting, but if we just understand these really simple and not many guidelines when it comes to Sanskrit, you'll see that the pronunciation becomes very simple. And regarding those things which are a bit more complex, you're going to see that I may generalize a little bit. If you have studied Sanskrit in other places, you may see that I simplify, but I'm not going to teach you something which is wrong in a sense. It might just not be the most accurate, and most likely I'll just say this is how it should be, and here is how we can do that. Now I have to say at this point that I'm not a Sanskritologist. I have not studied this in university, and the study of Sanskrit can be a very deep one. I studied Sanskrit for the purpose of pronouncing mantras properly. I have been doing this study for a few years now. And I always get a little bit more accurate, a little bit more accurate, a little bit more accurate. And at this moment, I feel that the knowledge that I have to pass on to you has enough accuracy to be passed on to others without me making any errors in the pronunciation. Yeah, so let's get right into it. Our class today is going to have three sections. In the first section, I'm just going to talk generally about Sanskrit. In the second section, I'm going to talk about the vowels of Sanskrit. And in the third section, I'm going to talk about the consonants. So let's get started with the first section, an introduction into Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a very ancient language. The most ancient texts that we have nowadays, the most ancient poems that we have today, are the Vedas, which are traditional Indian texts. The Rig Veda, which is the oldest one of them, is coming from at least 2000 BCE. It's hard to date it because there are no surviving manuscripts from that time era that I know of. But when a literary analysis of the texts happens, we see that it comes from about 4,000 or even 5,000 years ago. There are some speculations that it's coming from even older than that, but when it starts to become a date that we can actually say, yes, for sure 2000 BCE, this language is already in use. So it's a very old language, and one of the amazing things about Sanskrit is that the language has stayed almost unchanged. We're going to talk a little bit about the changes that have happened, because there's what is called classical Sanskrit, which is a bit more modern, and Vedic Sanskrit, but in general it's not a language which has changed as much as other languages have changed over time. Now, Sanskrit is considered to be a revealed language. What does that mean? It means that when it comes to human languages, the view is that human beings invented these languages and developed these languages over time. And Sanskrit is supposed to be a language which was not created by human beings, but rather revealed to human beings. And there's two speculations regarding how it was revealed. The mythological stories say that the gods in India means deities. It means very powerful beings that live in another substratum of the universe, and some of these beings are like universal beings, and some of them might be less universal, more limited, closer to us, but still they are much bigger, they live much longer, much wiser, and with access to a lot of levels of reality. And so some of the myths, they talk about how the gods brought this language to men, and it is called Deva Bhasa. Bhasa means speech, and Deva means deities. So this is, in a sense, the speech of the gods, and the gods taught this speech to humans, so humans will be able to worship the gods or pass communicate with the gods, etc. This can all be looked at as a metaphor for a language of some universal concepts, or a language of some levels of reality, for those of you who are uncomfortable with this idea of deities. And when looking at this idea of how Sanskrit might be a revealed language, a language which was not created by people, we can look at it as the metaphor that some people were sitting in meditation, and in their meditation, they came into contact with a certain layer of reality. And when they encountered the communications at that level, it took a form in their mind, and that form was Sanskrit. So these are the two versions of how Sanskrit can be a revealed language. Either it was given by some entities from some deeper layer of the universe, or that it was revealed to some people in meditation, that they kind of just intuited that language. It doesn't matter if that's the case. It doesn't even matter if the languages were created by man. I'm just sharing with you what is commonly accepted, mythologically speaking, within Sanskrit. Now, as I said, there is two types of Sanskrit. There is Vedic Sanskrit and there is classical Sanskrit. Now, Vedic Sanskrit is the Sanskrit which was used during the times of the Vedas. And the Vedic texts, the Rig Veda, the Atharva Veda, etc., they're written in this form of the language. And at that time, as is with all languages, there were several versions of this Vedic Sanskrit. There were several ways of pronouncing it. They weren't very different one from the other, but there were certain variations among areas because different people speak differently. The way they cut the words is differently, and we're going to touch about that in a moment. And so that changes a little bit the pronunciation. But as time grew, what happened was that the Sanskrit did start to change. And at a certain point, and we're not sure exactly when that point is, it's hard to date it, but it's probably around 500 BCE, a person called Panini took all of his knowledge into Sanskrit and codified the language under certain rules, which means he took all of the information about how Sanskrit should be pronounced, how Sanskrit words are created, how Sanskrit sentences are created, and he brought all of that together into a text, actually several texts. The main one of them is called Ashtadhyayi, which define how Sanskrit should be pronounced, structured, etc. Panini was the first linguist in the world, and actually up to these days, he's considered to be one of the most profound linguists of the world because his texts, with this Ashtadhyayi in its center, is still considered one of the deepest studies into language and language formation that we have in the world. So what Panini did is he took the Sanskrit language and he standardized it. He made it so that there would be only one Sanskrit, and from that moment onwards, all of the different versions of the Vedic Sanskrit coalesced into this Paninian Sanskrit. Now, you may hear different people pronounce different mantras in different ways. And what is beautiful about this Paninian Sanskrit is that it was codified in a way which doesn't actually go in different directions. If you want to pronounce Paninian Sanskrit correctly, there's a certain line that you need to follow. And the reason for that is because of the study of what is called phonology, which is the study of the science of sounds. There's a whole class of texts within the study of Sanskrit which are called shiksha. And these texts define how to create the different sounds of the language. Now, how do we define the sounds of the language? What makes sounds of the language? What makes the sounds is something called articulation. Articulation is basically how we shape our mouth in order to produce the sounds. Because what produces the sounds? We have our vocal cords, which can make various tones in the sounds. Ah. And if I keep my mouth open and I don't make any shape, neither with my mouth, neither with my nose, nothing, or with my tongue, for example, I just keep my mouth open, all I can make is these various tones, but they're all going to be of a certain sound. And this is ah, when the mouth is open. If I want to modulate this sound, if I want to create any other sound of language, I change the shape of my mouth. A, e, I, ma, la, ta. All of these all of these different sounds are created by changing the shape of the mouth and all of the organs, the lips, the tongue, the back of the throat, etc. Now, why is this important? It's important because we can actually teach a person to correctly pronounce a certain language or sounds, even if they can't hear it, or even if we can't say it to them. There is a lot of methods which have been developed in teaching people who have a hearing impediment to be able to talk properly, to talk in the way that is accepted, in the way that is understood by other people, as well as people who have suffered from strokes, for example, where they lose the ability to speech. Now, these are two very different schools, so I'm actually going to stick with how we teach somebody in speech therapy where they have a problem and they cannot control their mouth anymore. So you might tell them, okay, la is done with the tongue to the roof of the mouth, but they might not even be able to feel that their tongue is done with the roof, that the tongue is touching the roof of the mouth. So how do you do that? Let's take a sound which is more simple to demonstrate for all of us, and that is g. How do we pronounce g? What happens in our mouth when we make g? Well, what happens if you feel it? Say it a couple of times with me. G, g, g. G happens when we take the back part of the tongue and we put it against the roof of the mouth. So if I wanted to create that sound for a person that has no control over their mouth, or at least maybe they just don't understand what I mean, the back of the tongue, right? Maybe you're like, what do you mean the back of the tongue? So here's the thing, just go ah, and take your hand like this and press it into your chin from this angle and just say ah, and press it up and look what happens and listen to what happens. When you push mechanically the tongue to the roof of the mouth in this position, then you're going to be pushing the back of the tongue, and that's just mechanically going to produce these sounds. Let's do it from the side for a moment. Okay? Okay? So we can teach a person how to speak if we can just explain to them how to shape the mouth. And the beautiful thing about the study of Sanskrit is that it was defined already at the time of Panini what the shape is supposed to be, or at least where the sounds are supposed to be cut, where the sounds are supposed to be produced for each one of the letters. So we know which letter is supposed to come from the throat, which letter is supposed to come from the top of the mouth, etc. So since we know how the shape of the mouth needs to be, where the sounds are supposed to be produced from, we can tell what the sound of each letter should actually be, and therefore we will know how the language itself needs to sound. In this diagram, you can see a division of all of the Sanskrit letters. These are all of the consonants, as they are defined by their articulation, where the sounds are produced. And you'll see that in the top left, we have the gutturals. Guttural means the throat, so these are coming from the throat. And what you can see that is making the sound, especially pay attention to the shape of the tongue that you can see here. So if you look at the gutturals, you'll see that the gutturals are coming from the back of the throat, and the tongue is blocking that. Next, we have the palatal. The palatal are happening when the back part of the tongue is against the soft palate, which is the back part of the throat, the back part of the roof of the mouth. So the sound is coming from this area over here. Here, the sound was coming from this area. Then we have the Retroflex. Retroflex, there's a few other names to this, also cerebral. These are coming when the tongue is flexed backwards. So you can see that the tongue is probably the main organ which is important for us when we produce language. Then we have dental. Dental happens when the tongue is pressed against the root of the top teeth. And finally we have labial, which uses the lips, and you can see here that the lips are shut and the tongue does not come into play. So when we're going to study all of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, you're going to see that we can feel where they are in the mouth and we can understand how to pronounce them. But don't worry, it's not so important if we mix up a sound which is coming from one area or another, and you'll see when we reach to the letters that this is actually quite simple. Now, if you look at this writing, you're going to see that we have these writings up here, which are actually in Sanskrit writing. And the question is, how do we actually write that in English? Do we need to use all of these dots, etc.? And this is what I'm going to explain now. We call this transliteration. Transliteration is a way for us to write a different language with the same letters that we have in our own language, because not all languages have the same sounds. So the script which is used, the form that we use to write the different sounds in Sanskrit is called Devanagari, the script of the gods. We had Devabhasa, which is the speech of the gods, and now we have Devanagari, which is the script of the gods. Now, in Devanagari, we have 16 vowels, and we have 33 to 36 consonants. So we actually have 49, 50, 52, depending on the version that you're looking into, different sounds which are produced. But in English, we only have how many letters? 26. In other languages, we have 23, 22. I'm not sure about how many languages and how many letters we have in English. It's not my primary language. And so the question is, how do we write that in our own language? Not to mention the fact that sometimes there are sounds which we just don't have in our native language. So for example, there is a sound in Hebrew which is cha. How do we pronounce cha in English? How would we write it? Some people would write KH. That would probably be the closest way to writing it, and you'll see, we'll touch on a sound in Sanskrit which is very similar to that. Some people write it CH, but in English CH will be cha, right? Another example from the other way. In English, TH is the. But in Hebrew, for example, we do not have that sound. Okay? And then other languages are going to have other sounds which come from the throat, like ah, and sounds coming from African languages, like the sounds like this clicking which happens with the tongue. And how do we write these in English? And the truth is that we have a transliteration for all of these languages, so people who learn the transliteration are able to read texts which are written with English letters and some markings next to these letters, but to produce the sounds of those other languages, be it Hebrew, or be it Swahili, or be it Arabic, or any kind of other language. And so we're going to study a transliteration of the Sanskrit language into English. Okay? This transliteration is this writing with all of these marks. And you're going to see that there might be a lot of marks, but there's only a few that we need to pay attention to reach this 80 to 90% accuracy. All right. So let's move now to part 2 of this lecture, and we're going to start actually studying the vowels of Sanskrit.